All right, Bruce. So this story begins in Southlake, Texas.
It does, but it's really not about Southlake. It's about something so much bigger.
It is. My take is that this issue really centers around control and having control of a narrative and, really a perception of how that narrative is told.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how on kids' issues, so often the adults can't help themselves, but they make it all about them. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. From First Focus on Children, this is Speaking of Kids. I'm Bruce Lesley.
And I'm Stella Chluby. Speaking of Kids is a podcast that puts kids at the center of public policy.
So today we're really happy to have our guest, Mike Hixenbaugh, and he's got the number one selling book right now on Amazon called They Came for the Schools. And he does start this whole conversation about what's going on in the schools in Texas, but he does take it back much further.
I'm very excited for our guest today and the range of topics that he really brings up throughout the book. And the themes are really evergreen. These are things that we've talked about and have been issues in our society for centuries. And what I find fascinating about this topic is just the level of parental engagement and parental activism as it relates to how some of these societal qualms get played out and the battles get played out in public schools.
We've had these school war fights again and again and again, and they come in waves.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how these hot button issues and these important issues come up time and time again, and they trigger something, right? This is the next generation of children that are growing up with a perception, with a narrative of an understanding of what their reality is, of what history is. I mean, that's a big marker of just public education, period, is to get a sense of key moments and critical moments over time and how those critical moments and the reality around them are shaped and portrayed to children is important. And I think for parents, for adults, we take on, in some cases, an overwhelming amount of the need to control this narrative. And I think what happened in Southlake has become a blueprint for people that have woken up and said, hey, we don't like this narrative that's being told. And then the power and the ability to try to shift that through book bans and through, really lathering on personal feelings of something that really should just be factual, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, talking about going full circle is in our very first episode with our guest, Arnie Fahey. He talked a lot about sort of one of the other waves where we had this whole fight, which was after Brown versus Board of Education, and we had the fights over segregation. And so this continues to happen. And then in the 70s, 80s, the fights over things were like secular humanism. And in all of these waves, it is exactly as you said, a fight among adults over things having to do with politics, culture, religion. And I think our frustration is often the kids are sort of the afterthought.
Exactly. It's so easy to center these issues and personalize them and get so wrapped up in emotion about them that it's hard as an adult sometimes to take a step back and say, well, what's just factual? What's out there? And instead, what you see is this wave. And the interesting factor that played out in this scenario is it became a blueprint. And now we're seeing this wave across communities across the country. And that's scary.
No, I think that's right. And I think we should just get into it with Mike, because I think he does a really great job of walking us through how Southlake and also Grapevine, and for our listeners, he's got two really fantastic podcasts called Southlake and Grapevine on this topic as well. After you listen to our podcast, you should consider listening to those podcasts, because this fight is not just a fight over the schools in North Texas. This is a nationwide conversation that we need to have. And at some point, I really would hope that we really center kids in it and we embrace all of their needs.
That's right, Bruce. So for our audience, stick around. Peabody Award-winning journalist Mike Hixenbaugh is up in just a second. Mike is a senior investigative reporter for NBC News and author of They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity, and The New War for America's Classrooms.
So much of the coverage of this stuff doesn't center the voices of kids, and especially Black students and LGBTQ students. And I hoped that through the podcast and through the book, by sharing those perspectives, letting you hear directly from a teenager or recent graduate about what it feels like to move in those spaces, that it might be eye-opening for some parents.
Mike's coming up right after the break.
I cannot wait to hear what you guys talked about.
Making the world a better place for all children can seem like an impossibly huge task. Some of you may be thinking, I am just one person. What could I possibly do to make a difference? I'm Leila Nimatala, Vice President of Advocacy and Mobilization at First Focus on Children. And I'm inviting you to join us and become one of our volunteer advocates, whom we call our ambassadors for children. Ambassadors are our most active child advocates who raise critical issues with the U.S. Congress and with the administration related to child policy and funding decisions, both for kids in the U.S. and worldwide. But don't take my word for it. We asked one of our ambassadors to share her experience.
My name is Amy Jo Hutchison. I'm a born and raised West Virginian who also happens to be an economic justice organizer, and I'm the founder of a grassroots movement here, Rattle the Windows. What drew me to the ambassador program with First Focus on Children was my lived experience of poverty. As a mother of two, living in one of the poorest states in the nation, advocating for children in poverty is very personal to me. A lot of people see numbers when they look at data and reports, but when I see new findings and reports on child poverty, I see my kids, and I see their friends, our neighbors, and the people who I interact with every day. And I trust First Focus on Children. I have personally stepped into spaces that they've created for parents like me to be heard. What would I tell someone thinking about becoming an ambassador with First Focus on Children? Well, first of all, very few, if any, huge shifts in the way our country addresses economic justice issues have taken place without grassroots involvement. First Focus on Children has created an entry point for people like me to get involved with this ambassador program. It's an easily accessible way for us to become engaged, informed, and to turn our pain into power. I really hope you'll join them.
So please join us, won't you? Check out campaignforchildren.org/ambassadors on how to become a First Focus on Children ambassador and to link up with our fabulous community.
First Focus on Children is a bipartisan advocacy organization dedicated to making children and families the priority in federal policy and budget decisions.
First Focus moves beyond individual issues to serve a more important role, child advocacy. We educate lawmakers and the American public about the issues facing children.
To learn more about our work and ways you can become an ambassador, go to firstfocus.org.
Coming up on State of Play, we have First Focus's own Lily Clam, Director of Education Policy and all-around go-getter.
Mike Hixenbaugh is a senior investigative reporter for NBC News and co-host of the podcast Southlake and Grapevine. He's the author of a book that is really making waves and exposing the tactics of the far right in the never-ending battle for control over what our kids are allowed to learn. His book is They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity, and the New War for America's Classrooms. We are so excited to have Mike here today. Hi, Mike.
Bruce, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are really excited to have you join us today to talk about your just released book, They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight for Over Race and Identity, the New War for America's Classrooms. I have, and I think some of our listeners have probably followed you very closely in your reporting on the issues going on in Texas public schools and actually nationwide but also your outstanding previous podcast called Southlake and Grapevine, which I would urge our listeners to check out if they haven't already done so. Before we get into all that, I just wanted to ask you, like, what even brought you to these issues? Why a focus on kids and the public schools?
Well, so first of all, I'm a dad. I have 4 kids. And back in 2020, I was living and raising those kids with my wife in a suburb outside of Houston. You might remember 2020 was kind of a crazy year. So in the midst of the pandemic and the kind of growing backlash against racial justice protests that summer, I was seeing just intense acrimony and kind of the ugliness of national politics filtering down into my local suburb, my little subdivision in Cypress, Texas, outside of Houston. I mean, that was coming in like on the neighborhood Facebook page with, arguments over Black Lives Matter and people talking about gearing up to prepare for the attack by Antifa on Timberlake Estates. And so I started reporting from that vantage point of, wow, the suburbs have become this, and have always been, but really in 2020 had really become a political battleground, in part because were diversifying spaces that used to be primarily white, in some ways had been created to wall off suburban communities away from diversity and, urban problems such as crime and poor schools. And in the midst of reporting on that, I realized those issues were moving beyond neighborhood Facebook pages and into school board meetings. And so I happened to just at the very beginning wave of what became known as, the critical race theory backlash in public schools, I started documenting one of those fights on kind of the leading edge of that movement in Southlake, Texas. And so that became the reporting that was the basis for our podcast, Southlake, which is a central thread throughout the book as well. The story of this town, this affluent, majority white, but very much more diverse than it used to be, community that during the Trump years had tried to grapple with racism in the classroom, in the hallways, and to deal with something that had been just kind of bubbling under the surface for decades, really. And they came up with a diversity plan, and the backlash to that diversity plan in 2020 became like a model or a cautionary tale for communities all over the country as these really vitriolic campaigns against diversity, equity, and inclusion swept through school boards all over the country.
Yeah. I really also love that in the book you highlighted how these school wars that have been happening now are not anything new. We see this time and time again throughout history. And just as an aside, when I was editor of our high school newspaper, and we had an incident at the time in Texas where the Gablers were a East Texas couple who were going around the state trying to push book bans. And actually, we had a situation in our high school where there was a push to ban the Canterbury Tales, and we published it in our high school newspaper, and it blew up. But not in this way, obviously. But, I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit about these cycles and how they have had very different impetus for starting up a school war, but it has happened, and it seems to be periodic. So
I think this happens frequently where the moment that you're living in feels unprecedented, in part because I'm 39 years old. I didn't really live through the last big wave of this. And so for people my age who weren't writing, high school news articles about the Gablers trying to ban the Canterbury Tales, this felt really new. But while researching, of course, schools are the place where our society grapples with what to teach a new generation about what's right and what's wrong, about our history, how do we frame our history. And so, there's been repeated cycles, whether it's, the fight over how evolution was taught in the 1920s and 30s, or whether it was school integration, whether it was the fights over forced busing. The backlash wave moment that I kind of zone in on in the book is one that kind of was under the radar to me in the 1970s and 80s. In the aftermath of, the civil rights movement, there was this huge campaign against what the conservative Christian right had called secular humanism. And the parallels to today are just so striking. Secular humanism, if you look back at the article and news reports published back in the 1970s and 80s about the danger that secular humanism posed to children, and just swapped in the phrase critical race theory for secular humanism, you would not know that these are from the archives. And so largely suburban, white, Christian parents with the backing of a huge national network of activist groups like Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority and Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, kind of the precursors to Moms for Liberty of today, they waged an all-out campaign to get books and curricula out of classrooms that they deemed anti-American, anti-God, anti-family. They pushed hard for a focus on traditional gender roles in classroom lessons, and they were really opposed to lessons that depicted America as having any type of racism in its past, even its recent past, less than 10 years after MLK was assassinated. And yeah, you can see a lot of echoes. And in that case, much like today, a lot of these requests and demands were beat back and defeated at school boards and in state legislatures and at state boards of education. But it had incredible impact in leading to self-censorship, in creating a culture of fear in classrooms where teachers reported that, I don't know what secular humanism is. At some point, there was a federal ban even on secular humanism for a brief window. Poorly defined, not defined at all, really. And so teachers were just skipping over sections of history that they thought might get them in trouble, or leaving books off their shelves that they thought might anger somebody. And it's the exact same thing we're seeing today, except the difference today is there's been much more success in terms of codifying this. Like there's just been a wave of state laws in red states to ban certain perspectives and privilege a more, patriotic Christian perspective favored by folks like Ron DeSantis. And those policies have also been replicated at many school boards locally. And so, this modern iteration of this has been, I think, probably more effective than what we saw a generation ago.
I would agree with that. Having gone to school during that previous period, and now I'm revealing my age, but it was definitely disconcerting. And I recall going to college at points because it was somewhat effective, because I remember in college, learning about things like Tulsa and things like that were big, historical things that were never taught to us in Texas, publications. And you talk about that in the book.
That was my experience growing up in a rural, mostly white town in Northeast Ohio. I never heard of Tulsa.
Yeah.
I actually hadn't heard of Tulsa till just a couple of years ago. Honestly, but I didn't learn much at all about the racism embedded in America's past, or probably even more crucially, how to interact with people of different races and backgrounds and cultures. And it was same deal going off to college. I was unprepared and made a fool of myself at times. But I took some classes. I made some friends who didn't look like me, including my wife. And I look back on that time with kind of some regret or embarrassment of some of the things that I would say out of ignorance. And so that became a central thing I kept thinking about throughout reporting the book. In communities like Southlake, it was framed as they're trying to force these woke ideas, these anti-white ideas on our kids and teach white kids to hate themselves. And, I didn't really see that in what was being proposed. It was, from my perspective, it looked like a diverse group of community members who were saying it benefits all of our kids who are going to leave this town, the Southlake bubble, and go out into the world to reckon now as teenagers with the truth about America's history, and to have some conversations about how different people experience the world based on their race or appearance or ethnicity or religious background. And that includes for white kids. I heard from a white student in Southlake, a graduate who, same experience I had, went off to college and looked back on how she treated her black classmates, especially a black friend at Southlake, with just utter shame, because she'd make jokes to her like, haha, you're the smartest black girl I know, which means most black people are stupid, but you're smart. And it took her, again, going off somewhere else to learn those lessons. And that's kind of, I think, what maybe is at stake here in some of these fights, is taking away the opportunity for kids like me to learn a lesson earlier about how to just interact with kindness in the world.
They came so close to actually, taking steps to doing this and having a conversation about addressing problems that were inherent in the school with respect to race and identity, and we're on the precipice and then pulled away. So can you tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what I call Southlake's near racial reckoning started in 2018, really, when a video of a group of white high school students, sophomores, at a homecoming after party recorded themselves chanting the N-word in kind of a call response way. Hey, we get to say the N-word, and laughing. That thing got posted on like maybe Snapchat, and another classmate sent it to, posted it on Twitter. And so the thing went viral, and it was really embarrassing. But it wasn't the video. I always like to point this out. It wasn't the video that sparked the whole process of trying to address racism. The video sparked a lot of Black parents and parents of Black children to come forward at this kind of, emotional school board meeting in 2018, where they were coming forward and telling stories of just the racist things their kids heard and experienced on kind of a daily or weekly basis as minorities in a mostly white town like Southlake. And it was those stories, and not just Black parents, but also parents of LGBTQ kids, they were sharing these experiences, and that's what triggered the school board to kind of put together a committee to study the climate at the school and to make recommendations. One of the things I note in the book is that same kind of pattern was playing out in suburban school districts all over the country. And, we can thank probably to a large part Donald Trump and his rise to power and his election in 2016 for triggering that, because it became forefront in the national conversation, discussions about this kind of rise of white nationalism, the anti-immigrant rhetoric that was part of his campaign. Those things were leading to more incidents in schools, kind of like the Southlake N-word video, where kids were, graffitiing stalls with, "Make America Great Again," "Go Back to Africa," KKK, "Jews will burn" kind of language. And I document in the book, there was an increase in these kinds of incidents and an increase in media reports about them. And so you're seeing the same kind of pattern across the country. Schools that have grown more diverse in the last 10 or 20 years, they have a triggering incident like the N-word video, an outpouring of comments from parents. And then in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, an effort to try to address those things. It just so happens in Southlake's case, the pandemic hit, George Floyd happened. Americans were sitting at home watching cable news programs that either framed nationwide protests as kind of like this once-in-a-generation attempt to reckon with America's past, or like a lawless assault on cities by people who want to destroy America. And so when the Carroll Independent School District in Southlake, the school board released its plan to address racism, everyone who wasn't really clued into the plan saw it through that lens. And the people who believed that these attempts to address racism were anti-police, was an attempt to destroy institutions and attack white people and attack America, they got mobilized in a way that made the initial backlash to the racist video look tiny. We started to see that same pattern also across the country.
We know that children are listening and watching what we do. And I think that your characterization of what happened after the 2016 election and some of the rhetoric and sort of the attacks on certain countries and immigrants from certain countries, and you saw it and you documented it in the book. I found some of the stories chilling. Kids at a school in Illinois who were chanting build the wall," and leaving the Hispanic kids, crying during lunch hour and stuff like that. Just really disturbing. And it really does go to show that kids watch, listen, and mimic. As a child advocate, one of the things I would say all the time is people will say things like, "Stop acting childish," or whatever, when it's really, in this case, it's been the adults who've been acting so poorly. And you saw it, and you really highlight a lot of it, sort of the vitriolic, fights going on at the school board meetings and in the community, and some of the attacks that people who spoke out were really experiencing. Let me just read for our listeners one quote, and it came from a student who, make sure I pronounce her name right, is it Zanetta?
Zanetta Ogunmola, that's right.
Yeah. After the video came out where the kids were chanting the N-word, and you quoted her saying, "I never knew a single word could reduce me to feeling like gum on the bottom of someone's shoe, like nothing." And I just read that. I had to read that like 3 times and get up and walk away for a period. And I just found like that was so powerful to me. And, words hurt.
That's one of the things I hope to convey. One thing that my colleague Antonia Hilton and I talked about all the time while reporting the podcast, and that I've thought about a lot while working on the book, is so much of the coverage of this stuff doesn't center the voices of kids, and especially Black students and LGBTQ students. And I hoped that through the podcast and through the book, by sharing those perspectives, letting you hear directly from a teenager or recent graduate about what it feels like to move in those spaces, that it might be eye-opening for some parents who might be, upset by the caricature of what's being described as critical race theory. This idea that, no, I don't want the schools to teach my kids that all white people are evil and that all Black people are victims. That if we could show what the actual plan was about, what these lessons are about, and then give them the perspective of a student like Zanita or Raven Roll or Nikki Olele, who are all quoted in the book, and that talk about what it feels like when you hear these comments, when someone pokes your skin with a pencil and then jokes about how you can't feel that because you're Black, because you have that thick Black skin, or making jokes about lynchings. And I've heard people do this. It's just words. It's just a dumb joke. It's just dumb kids making a video at a party. Yeah, it's stupid, but it's not that big of a deal. It's hard to listen to some of these students and hear their experiences and reach that conclusion that it doesn't matter. And in fact, there's studies that show increasing evidence that this idea of weathering that minority students or just Black people in society experience from this kind of constant stream of incidents that some people may say, that's no big deal, let's not make a big deal about it. That those incidents add up and actually lead to like physical and mental health struggles. And there's correlation studies that show the more kids endure those things, the more struggles they'll have. And so it does matter. And so setting heated political rhetoric aside, is there a space where there's a conversation to at least get on the same page that we don't think kids should experience that?
Yeah.
You can debate the policy, and I don't actually weigh in on like, oh, they need to have this kind of training, or they need to read Ibram X. Kendi or whatever. I don't know what the solution is, but I know that there's a lot of people who are trying to address real issues in good faith who've been painted as radical leftists who want to hurt kids, and it's just upside down.
I will say there's about 100 reasons why I loved your book, but then also the work you and Antonia Hilton did in the podcast about really lifting up kids and the voices of kids. I mean, at the end of the day, education is about kids. It's not about all the adults, and so much of what politicians talk about and what even other media folks do is really focus on the adults. And I think you really captured in a very important way that there's really sort of different camps. And so there's teachers and parents who you highlight in the book who are really focused on the purpose of education is for all the kids. Then there's sort of another set of people that kind of came on the precipice of doing that and then pulled away. And they decided in some ways that really what's important is to maintain status quo, maintaining sort of, a position for their children, their white children and wealthy children, of their position and status in the schools. And then the sort of this third set of people that you also talked about sort of later in the book, which are really politicizing schools for political purposes and religious purposes and ideological purposes. So the kids whose voices you lift up are really being hit by three different viewpoints.
Yeah.
How did you guys sort of pull all those pieces together? I thought you did a remarkable job of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great observation because especially the parents, there are people who have genuine good faith concerns that they're bringing to their school boards. And when I say good faith, I mean they believe what they're saying. They're worried about this emphasis on race. They come from this idea of like we should be colorblind and not acknowledge or think about race in a practical way. And you can debate with that, but I don't think most of those folks who I tried to talk to, who I quote throughout the book, are doing this as some sort of big like political maneuver. But there are groups, some of the same folks who were trying to wage this fight in the 80s, these national political organizations and even local and regional political groups that are doing something different. And they saw kind of the outrage building, this feedback cycle between parents or at school boards and Fox News is amplifying that, and it's leading to more and more of these conflicts across the country. There are groups that saw that, groups that have, for example, spent decades pushing for school privatization, school vouchers, let's give school choice. There are groups who openly talked about there's a lot of people really mad about pandemic, safety measures in schools, school closures, and critical race theory. This is a once in a generation opportunity to finally push through this thing. Like, parents are mad at schools. They don't trust public schools. And it became, as Chris Rufo said at one point, to reach a point of universal school choice, you have to operate from a perspective of universal public school distrust. I think he later tried to back away from that exact framing or denied that's what he meant. But that's what you can see happening. You can also see some groups on the Christian right who've pushed this idea of America was founded as a Christian nation, explicitly Christian nation with laws based on the Bible, and schools and the government are meant to reflect that. This is why we got to bring back daily school prayer and get the Bible back in schools, get pastors or chaplains into public schools, put the 10 Commandments up in every classroom. Because if we don't, you're going to see more transgender kids. It's really kind of the message that you heard. Yeah. That movement predates all of this. And maybe it was bubbling at the fringes or out of sight. But what they really did is they saw the wave of attention and genuine parental anger in some places and kind of hitched their wagon to it. And that's the third group that you're talking about, is kind of like this political organizing that is trying to both stir this anger at the grassroots and then capitalize on it for their kind of separate political objectives, pre-existing goals.
Yeah. I think what was also interesting about what you captured in the book is sort of the backlash to the backlash. In Southlake, they certainly have had their way in large part with, the assistance of some of these political opportunists and to really pass some of these policies. But you're seeing, in Grapevine, they've definitely done some of that, but there's forces that are, have organized to protect public schools. And then you also highlighted, for example, in Round Rock, there was actually a pushback and, a defeat of efforts to impose, book bans and curriculum changes, the whitewashing of curriculum and speech codes and things like that, and to really protect the public schools in a different way.
One of the things that kind of bubbled up from the right after Southlake made national news for kind of beating back against critical race theory and taking control of their school board, it kind of became this conventional wisdom. You heard it from people like Steve Bannon and again Chris Rufo, that here's the key to winning back the suburbs for Republicans. This fight, this critical race theory fight, and it's going to bring back all of these, white suburban moms who were uncomfortable with Trump's whatever, everything that deal with it. And so I don't think we have strong evidence that has panned out. And instead, what's really happened is, now that we've gone through a couple cycles of these school board elections and state races tied to these fights, and the other side has kind of started to get organized and people understand what's happening, I think what's really happened is, it's not that there's been this huge swing to the right in these suburban school districts. It's previously nonpartisan local politics are now completely reflective of the national political divides. And so if you live in a town like Southlake that was Trump plus 30 in 2020, well, your school board is going to go to these folks by a similar measure. We've seen that repeatedly. But if you live in a suburban school district like Grapevine that was more evenly divided, your town's going to be more evenly divided as these groups pair off and campaign on national political issues at the local level. I think there's been a lot of reporting lately, like Moms for Liberty is losing, they're striking out all over the place. And it's kind of like the line is drawn at the MAGA Republican Trump base and then everybody to the left of that.
Yeah, including like a lot of moderate Republican moms. Yeah,
exactly. Right. They're definitely having impact, and they're moving the needle in state legislatures that are fully captured by Trump's MAGA base.
Yeah.
And in towns where Trump is, still the favored presidential candidate. But elsewhere, it's not the case. And it's really mobilized in places like Round Rock and now Grapevine and many other places, these kind of progressive parents groups who are playing catch up to some degree and trying to model the political strategy that conservative groups like Southlake Families PAC pioneered.
Yeah.
And they're finding success in places, even with less money. At Round Rock, that the progressive / moderate Republican group was outfunded maybe 3 or 4 to 1, but they still won by 10 points. It's a proxy for the national political scene perspective in that town. And that's been repeated all over.
You're right. I think you're starting to see, like, for example, the Moms for Liberty endorsed candidates a lot more lost this last round. And I'm wondering what you think about if these things happen in cycles. Are we sort of on the down curve of this cycle, or do you think it's going to continue for a while?
I mean, I think it's worth watching the school board elections and then the November election, because there's certainly people who have kind of built an identity around this, at least for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
The framing of we're fighting forces of evil. Some people have adopted that perspective. I don't think that those folks are going to suddenly drop it. But whether or not big political money is going to keep flowing into this cause if it's not generating the results people want, I think that's a good question. And I do think it's possible that we're at a moment where this maybe will plateau and start to die off. But I don't know. I'm not going to try to predict the future.
Yeah.
You're asking me this question as I'm launching a book out into the world about whether or not people still care about this subject. I do think that, from what I'm hearing, there's still a ton of energy and activism around this. And there's communities where somehow they've avoided having these fights, and now it's kind of sparking now.
Yeah.
And so it's still unfolding.
Still happening. Yeah. Well, actually, and in Texas, there's still the fights over school privatization and the primary fights that happened, and some Republican members who decided to protect their public schools may have lost because, or did lose their races for various reasons, and with the governor coming out against them. But on the other hand, in the fall elections, there may be some different election outcomes where some of those people then are defeated in the final race. So it is, I agree with you. I think that this is going to continue to play out. And the book, I think it was very apparent that that's a difficult job to do, and that it actually came at a cost in some respects for you personally, and that as you were interviewing some of the kids who were, LGBTQ, people attacked you personally for that. And so can you talk a little bit about that and how you overcame those kinds of attacks and kept up, your goal of centering kids?
As a reporter, I've been doing this for a decade and a half. I'm going on 2 decades, and so I'm used to getting nasty emails, and that's from the very beginning of my reporting career. But some of the backlash we got for this was a little more intense, especially out of Southlake, where kind of a right-wing agitator made a whole podcast episode about me and Antonia and like where our families live. And just the kind of bizarre, someone made a t-shirt in Southlake with my high school, the tiny town where I grew up in Ohio. It said, "Go G-Men, go big or go home," something like that. And his speech that night was about how the town where I grew up was way more racist than Southlake. And I was like, well, probably. I didn't know what the point was. But the moment where I felt like where it actually hit and hurt, I had interviewed a 17-year-old queer student in Katy, Texas, for a story about how, the pivot had started where they were going after books on LGBTQ themes and books that feature descriptions of sex, and kind of this massive wave of library book challenges. And I interviewed a 17-year-old who talked about how her parents were not accepting or opposed LGBTQ identities. And so she's not out to them, but she wanted me to know that the library, because of that, was the one place where she felt like she could read books, where she saw herself reflected or find answers to questions that she didn't feel safe, searching on the home Wi-Fi. And so I quoted her without naming her in the article. And the next day I got a wave of messages and phone calls from this group of moms, unconnected to this kid, but this group of moms in Katy, who told me that me talking to that student in any way about her sexuality or sexual orientation was the first step toward sexually grooming a child. And they felt like this was grounds to file a police report for soliciting a minor. And they were preparing a report for, to send to the Katy police. I know that it was nonsense and it was bogus and it wouldn't lead to anything. But this whole okay groomer, you're a child predator attack.
Right. As a father of four.
It's devastating.
Yeah.
Now, and I understand, it made me understand what teachers and librarians, just a little taste of what they're experiencing.
Absolutely.
I feel like I've got thick skin. I'm hardened against this stuff. But that one hit me. I had to sit down. I went and talked to my wife. And I thought about, like, what the hell is this? Why do I want to do this? And if that hit me, I can just imagine. I'm a kind of a public figure being in journalism. So I kind of expect some of this. But a school librarian, how do you keep going after someone says that you're trying to sexually groom kids with books?
Yeah.
And that really made all of this hit home for me.
I found that very disturbing, and it's sort of like no good deed goes unpunished, because what you're doing is really lifting up the voices of people who have been invisibilized in our country, and kids in those schools. They're the ones, like if we really do care in this country about educating all of our children, we do need to embrace them and understand their thoughts, feelings, concerns. And I really do. I really just want to say again, I really appreciate the work you and Antonia have done about really lifting up those voices. So often they're just not. So that leads to my last question for you, which is, this work is hard. And we've asked all our podcast guests, is there a song or songs that really inspire you and keep you motivated and in doing this work?
On the spot, I'm always going to just go to Jason Isbell. My Jason Isbell fandom is a core part of my identity, my wife will probably tell you. And I don't know if I can point to a specific song. What I love about his music is the way that he makes you feel something. He tells you a story, a character-driven story. He does it so precisely with so few words, and you're just kind of knocked off your feet with how he makes you like immersed in a story. His new album came out in the midst of this, and there's one song on there in particular that's focused on his reaction to the shooting in Uvalde. That song's really resonated with me, and it focused on the kind of shared trauma that we all have picked up based on the constant coverage of incidents of school shootings. I had been down at Uvalde during the course of reporting on this. And at one point, I remember knocking on the door of a teacher who'd been in the classroom next door to the shooting. And she just talked about how she had her kids, got them like on the floor and quiet, and was like kind of praying over them, like that they'd be safe. This was in 2022, right? In a year when teachers were being accused of wanting to hurt kids and indoctrinate them. She was like, no, I love the kids like they're mine, and I just wanted to keep them safe. And so, yeah, that song is in my head. If you haven't heard it, it'll get you crying as a dad. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that as a storyteller, you picked a storyteller for your song. So I love that. Well, thanks so much again for joining us today, Mike. And again, for our listeners, I really encourage you all to pick up a copy of his book. They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New War for America's Classrooms. And also, if you liked listening to him today, you should go back and listen to the outstanding podcast that he and his co-host, Antonia Hilton, did, entitled Southlake and Grapevine, an outstanding podcast series. And so, again, thanks so much, Mike, for all you do and for joining us today. I think our listeners will really enjoy it.
Thank you, Bruce. I really enjoyed this.
On today's State of Play, we welcome Lily Clam, who's our education guru here at First Focus on Children. Welcome, Lily.
Thanks so much for having me to talk about this.
Absolutely. So just wanted to start off by saying, we talked to Mike Hixenbaugh about his new book and all that's going on in Texas. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the work you've been doing at First Focus on Children. So tell us, what is the Alliance for Student Liberty?
Yeah, so as you know, we launched the Alliance for Student Liberty last year, which really tries to fight back against the attacks we're seeing all across the country on public education. The voucher movement, which was hugely successful last year at stripping money from public schools to private schools, the book banning, the censorship, whitewashing of curriculum across schools have all been really apparent, and while we've been seeing some serious indication that voters are not agreeing with this, Moms for Liberty was a group that one of the reasons we started the Alliance, to provide some opposition against some of their policies. And, groups like that, we saw some major losses. But what we're also seeing, unfortunately, is that some of the policies they're supporting haven't backed down. While most voters strongly oppose book bans, there were actually more books banned during the first half of the school year than the entire last school year. So, we're just really trying to connect the dots on some of these attacks on public education and let people know that these are connected.
One of the things Mike talked a lot about in the podcast is that a lot of the efforts have been driven by billionaires in Texas and some of the groups affiliated with Betsy DeVos, who is President Trump's Secretary of Education, who are really fueling a lot of the AstroTurf groups like Moms for Liberty. So what do they want? What have been the results of these push policies?
A strategy that these billionaires have been using and have been, pushing their candidates to do is to really undermine the importance of public education, to destabilize it. So that's a major strategy that we've been seeing. And somebody else really interesting who came out recently to talk about this is Courtney Gore, who was a former far-right school board candidate who was elected, who ran on a pro-voucher and anti-leftist indoctrination in schools campaign completely. And after she served on the school board, she really came out to say that actually there's no leftist indoctrination in our schools, and this voucher movement is just being pushed by billionaires. We've been seeing some really concerning results across the country for our vouchers. Like in Arizona, for example, their budget has been completely overhauled. Vouchers are one of the main reasons for that. They did not realize how much this would really cost them, and the governor received a lot of criticism for trying to push out a plan that would require students to go to public schools for 100 days. People really did not like that. And we even saw the lack of accountability in the vouchers. Arizona is a great case study of that. You'll see it in other places like Florida, where they're paying for completely irresponsible things like family trips to Disneyland, for example. So we're just seeing that the lack of accountability in these vouchers are stripping public schools of their funding to pay for some ridiculous expenses. I mean, like luxury car lessons, like things students absolutely don't need. And our lowest income students are hurting the most from these policies.
Yeah, you see this really driving disparities across the board. And my sense is always follow the money, and then you'll see where a lot of this stems. And, to Bruce's point, Mike really showcased how this is really taking on a grassroots movement across the country. And so an organization like First Focus that is building out, our ambassadors, our listenership is growing week over week, but still there's a disconnect between what's going on as it relates to federal policy and this silent movement that's brewing and is actually really not so silent. How do you tackle something like this? What is the best ways, and what are you seeing in Congress right now to really counter this?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And I think that a lot of the responses are really trying to reframe the conversation around the importance of public education and supporting our teachers. And really, the evidence for this is within the data. We see that, vouchers do not produce strong results. The House Appropriations released a budget proposal that talked about cutting Title I, which is funding to our low-income schools, by 80% last year. And I think that that was really showing that this movement, these attacks on public education, this is not just like a state school board issue. This is showing up over and over again everywhere, even in our federal government. So that has definitely required our federal lawmakers to step up and advocate against that. And something else, unique we've been seeing in Texas, these really unlikely alliances are coming together and fighting against these policies. Like Grandparents for Public Schools is a group in Texas that's been very active and very vocal on the issue, opposing vouchers. We've also seen groups like pastors for Texas children talking about how these policies actually undermine the importance of separation of church and state, and these are pastors coming together and talking about these issues. So it's really concerning, the trends that we've been seeing, but we've also been seeing some really major losses from groups like Moms for Liberty.
Even here in Montgomery County, where I live in Maryland, there was a candidate who ran sort of on the privatized public schools agenda. She actually ran a very quiet campaign that she was just for kids, but people did expose her and she did not make the runoff. So that was a positive thing. And so I just wanted to ask you about some victories for the pro-public schools community.
Yeah, in places like Round Rock, there was a coalition of far-right extremist candidates hoping to destabilize public education called the Round Rock One Family PAC, and they failed to win any of the 5 seats that they were going for, and this is in a state where there were conservative wins all across the state. And although they were backed by billionaires, the parents and teachers and families really experiencing these harms are the ones that fought back against this and did not stand to let their school boards continue to be run by people who, didn't support the true important things for their students and the families.
It's important to note that that was not a left-right fight. In fact, in Round Rock, it was actually the non-MAGA conservatives and the more progressive groups came together to defend public schools. And that also happened at the state legislative level in Texas, where many Republicans opposed vouchers, particularly in rural areas. And in coalition with Democrats, they defeated Governor Abbott's push.
Yeah, this is common sense, right? And especially in a post-COVID world where parents had a taste of what it was like to have their kids around the clock and get virtual training or to set up a homeschool-like setting, the value of public education and the role it serves in society is unmatched. And, we had guests on earlier, Dr. Kirabo Jackson, that actually argues we need more investments in public education, especially in the early years. And so my hope is that, to our listeners and to teachers and educators and these unlikely partners and allies, is that we really take a step back and ask the question that we ask all the time at First Focus is this in the best interest of the children? And my hope is that with this particular issue, people can really start to wake up and say, hey, what's going on here? This doesn't make sense. This is not what we signed up for. And more importantly, we don't want the limited resources that already are allocated for public schooling to be diverted.
So, Lily, thanks so much for joining us today. If people wanted to find more information about the Alliance for Student Liberty, how can they find that?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, too, for this important conversation. Would love everyone to subscribe to the Alliance for Student Liberty to receive a newsletter and become up to date with what's going on these attacks on public education we're seeing. You can find this by going on First Focus's Substack page and looking at the tab that's the Alliance for Student Liberty. And we will put the link in the show notes as well.
Lily, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lily.
Thanks for having me.
This is Speaking of Kids. Thanks for listening. I'm Bruce Lesley.
And I'm Aselach Luby. Special thanks to our guests, Michael Hixenbaugh and Lily Clam.
Speaking of Kids is a podcast by First Focus on Children.
Elizabeth Wyndham is the supervising producer, and Julia Wyndham is the associate producer.
Layla Nematala is the advocacy and mobilization producer, and the senior producer is Jay Woodward.
Our theme music is Don't Look Twice by Sam Barsh.
For more information about this week's episode, go to firstfocus.org. You can find all of our links in our show notes.
If you have any thoughts, questions, or interest in becoming a First Focus on Children ambassador, email us at speakingofkids@firstfocus.org.
And please follow, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube.
Speaking of Kids is produced by Windhaven Productions and Blue Jay Atlantic.